In the next 60 seconds, you will discover the exact moment a global military alliance fractured under the weight of its own secrets. 10 helicopters lifted off into the pitch-black sky over southern Lebanon. They were not delivering supplies. They were not inserting reinforcements. They were carrying the dead and wounded away from a battlefield that was immediately erased from the public record. Within hours of the deadliest single strike of the entire ground campaign, the military machine slammed down an iron wall of total censorship. No casualty numbers, no footage, no operational details, complete and absolute silence. For the American taxpayers funding this war, it was as if that blood-soaked night never happened. But that silence is hiding a strategic betrayal that should be front-page news across the country. The United States entered this conflict shoulder to shoulder with its most vital Middle Eastern ally. We committed our forces. We committed our treasury. 13 American service members are already dead. Gas prices have surged by over $1 a gallon, quietly bleeding the working class dry. We are paying the ultimate price for what was sold to the public as a shared strategic objective. But now, the partner that ordered the meal is walking away from the bill. Israel's most watched news network just confirmed a terrifying reality. If the United States launches a ground invasion into Iran, Israeli soldiers will absolutely not be joining them. Not in a limited capacity, not in a support role, not at all. While 2,500 United States Marines deploy for an operation that Pentagon war games predict will be a historic catastrophe, Washington is desperately trying to control the narrative. You're about to see exactly why the architects of this war are terrified of what happens next, and why the American people are being set up to pay for a disaster they never voted for. Generations of Americans have been conditioned to believe that military supremacy is an absolute guarantee. When billions of taxpayer dollars flow into a foreign military machine, the public naturally assumes that victory will be swift, sterile, and inevitable. We expect to see high-definition footage of precise strikes and collapsing enemy infrastructure broadcast on the evening news. But the reality of this conflict does not look like a polished press briefing. It looks like the pitch-black sky over southern Lebanon. 10 military helicopters tore through the darkness on a mission that the High Command desperately wanted to hide. They were not carrying elite assault teams into enemy territory. They were acting as airborne ambulances, frantically evacuating dead and wounded soldiers away from the front lines. It was a massive and chaotic extraction from what local media described as the deadliest single strike on Allied forces in the entire Lebanon campaign. The moment those rotors stopped spinning, the military command imposed a total and absolute blackout. No official casualty numbers were released. No images were permitted to broadcast. No operational details were shared with the press. Complete censorship fell over the nation within hours. You have to understand the psychology of this decision. This blackout was not about keeping operational secrets from the enemy. The enemy already knew exactly what they had done. This censorship was specifically designed to keep a terrifying truth hidden from the public. When a government suppresses the details of a major battle, they are acting out of pure political fear. They are terrified that the citizens footing the bill will suddenly realize that the war is spinning completely out of control. For the American taxpayers underwriting this conflict, the night those helicopters flew was simply erased from existence. But burying a disaster does not stop the bleeding. It only hides the fact that the supposedly invincible war machine is currently driving straight into a trap. The official briefings from the Defense Ministry painted a picture of inevitable victory. The public was told that the enemy forces in southern Lebanon were completely degraded. Their command and control was supposedly shattered. Their leadership was eliminated. The operation was meant to be a straightforward push to establish a northern buffer zone. That is the official story. The operational reality is a nightmare. 400,000 troops were mobilized for this ground campaign. It is an overwhelming concentration of military power. Yet, as of this week, those forces have failed to establish control over a single frontline town. The advance routes pushing into southern Lebanon are no longer described as strategic corridors. Observers in direct contact with the front lines are calling them a graveyard for tanks. You must understand the staggering asymmetry of this battlefield. Millions of dollars in advanced heavy armor are being systematically dismantled in the rocky terrain. The adversary waiting for them was never the broken, desperate militia described in the press conferences. Instead of throwing their forces into a futile frontal assault, they preserved their most elite units. They absorbed the initial bombardment and waited. When the moment arrived, they executed a masterclass in tactical patience. They coordinated their ground strikes to land at the exact second that waves of Iranian missiles were already saturating the aerial defense grids. That level of synchronization requires iron discipline and an intact command structure. It is the signature of a highly capable military organization that knows exactly how to bleed a technologically superior invading force. The armored columns were sent into a meat grinder, and the senior security officials monitoring the simultaneous attacks are now expressing deep pessimism. They are facing a terrifying reality. They are not advancing. They are simply providing more steel for the graveyard. The foundation of this entire war was built on a promise of absolute solidarity. The United States entered this conflict shoulder to shoulder with its most critical regional ally. It was presented to the public as a declared partnership, a coordinated strike, and a unified front. The American people were told that the staggering costs they were about to absorb were for a shared strategic victory. 13 American service members have already lost their lives. Working-class families are watching their bank accounts drain as gas prices surge by over $1 a gallon. The United States is bleeding money and military resources to stabilize the global energy markets and secure the Strait of Hormuz. But the partner who stood beside America on day one has suddenly decided they are finished playing their part. One of the most widely watched news networks in Israel just broadcast a reality that Washington is desperate to ignore. If the United States launches a ground operation against Iran, Israeli forces will not be participating. They are not offering logistical support. They are not committing reserve units. They are sitting out the most dangerous phase of the war entirely. This is not a minor diplomatic disagreement. It is a calculated strategic abandonment. Washington desperately needs a deal on Iran to stabilize the oil markets and calm a furious domestic population. Israel, however, is entirely focused on finishing its grinding campaign in Lebanon. Iran saw this fracture and set a brilliant diplomatic trap. Tehran absolutely refused to accept any ceasefire agreement that did not include the Lebanese front, perfectly wedging the two allies apart. Faced with that impossible choice, the unbreakable alliance shattered. The United States is now staring down a catastrophic ground invasion entirely alone. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a partner ordering the most expensive feast on the menu, standing up from the table and walking out the door, leaving the American taxpayer to pay the massive bill in blood and billions of US dollars. Washington is currently moving the pieces into place for an operation that history will record as a strategic catastrophe. 2,500 United States Marines, specialists highly trained for amphibious assault, have just touched down in the Middle East. The administration is openly discussing a military operation to seize Karg Island, the beating heart of the Iranian oil export economy. Politicians stand at their podiums and assure the public that a limited strike can achieve American objectives without dragging the nation into a wider conflict. That is a fatal delusion. Men in tailored suits look at a map and think they are planning another Iraq. But comparing this to the invasion of 2003 drastically undersells the nightmare. Iraq was a fractured, exhausted nation. Iran is a unified fortress of 90 million people. It is 4 times the geographic size of Iraq. An invading force would not be rolling triumphantly across flat desert highways. They would be marching directly into the Zagros Mountains. This is a brutal, jagged, unforgiving terrain that has swallowed entire empires throughout recorded history. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent 4 uninterrupted decades building a military doctrine specifically designed to turn those mountains into an absolute slaughterhouse for an invading army. A limited operation to seize a coastal island sounds clean in a press briefing, but military professionals know the truth. Within 30 days, those Marines will be bogged down. They will need massive reinforcements and a constant lifeline of supplies. The simple gravity of holding hostile territory instantly transforms a surgical strike into a permanent, grinding occupation. Pentagon war games have already run the terrifying mathematics on this exact scenario. The results are identical every single time. A ground invasion demands hundreds of thousands of combat troops. It guarantees years of bloody urban and mountain warfare. And the casualty models predict American losses that will easily eclipse the combined deaths of every single military engagement since September 11th. Yet the deployment orders are still being drawn up. A massive ground war against a nation of 90 million people requires one absolute necessity. It demands an endless supply of young bodies, but the architects of this invasion are aggressively ignoring a terrifying mathematical reality. The United States military has completely run out of volunteers. We are currently witnessing the most severe and catastrophic recruiting crisis in the last 4 decades. The Pentagon is missing its enlistment targets by the tens of thousands. The younger generation of Americans has watched their parents and older siblings return from the deserts of the Middle East with shattered bodies and broken minds, all for conflicts that ultimately ended in diplomatic failure. They have absolutely zero interest in bleeding to death in a foreign mountain range to secure global energy markets or protect the profit margins of defense contractors. The volunteer force is exhausted. The reserve units are stretched to their absolute breaking point across multiple global theaters. So a chilling question must be asked. When those 2,500 Marines get bogged down on an Iranian beachhead, and the Pentagon suddenly demands 300,000 fresh combat troops to hold the line, where exactly are those soldiers going to come from? There is only one answer, and it is the ultimate political third rail. The phantom of the military draft is creeping back into the halls of Washington. To sustain a grinding occupation in the Zagros Mountains, the government will be forced to reach directly into the homes of the American middle class. They will have to institute forced conscription, ripping young citizens out of their civilian lives to feed a meat grinder halfway across the planet. If the administration crosses that line, they will not just ignite a war abroad, they will detonate an uncontrollable political revolution right here at home. Modern warfare is no longer a romantic contest of capturing territory or raising flags over conquered capitals. It has evolved into a brutal mathematical equation of bankruptcy. The generals in Tehran know perfectly well that they cannot defeat the United States military in a conventional head-to-head naval battle, but they also know they do not have to. Their strategy is far more insidious. They have designed a decentralized network of regional actors to execute a flawless war of financial attrition. When forces strike shipping lanes from Yemen, when militias fire on remote outposts in Iraq, and when Hezbollah synchronizes massive aerial bombardments from Lebanon, they are not trying to win a decisive victory. They are deliberately forcing the United States military to continuously fire its most expensive weapons at the cheapest possible targets. Consider the terrifying asymmetry of this new battlefield. The American military is routinely forced to launch interceptor missiles that cost millions of dollars each just to shoot down mass-produced suicide drones that cost roughly $20,000 to assemble. Every single time a United States warship successfully defends itself, the American taxpayer loses a fortune. It is a slow, methodical financial execution. Iran is deploying a textbook bleeding strategy. They are expanding the conflict across multiple simultaneous geographic fronts, perfectly aware that every new front adds an unbearable financial burden to the American defense budget. The ultimate goal is not military conquest. The goal is to ensure the price of continuing the war vastly exceeds the political and economic capacity of Washington to keep paying for it. The United States is caught in a lethal trap where winning tactical daily skirmishes is actively bankrupting the nation, and this financial hemorrhage is being quietly enabled by a much larger global force standing right behind the curtain. The evening news broadcasts love to present a very simple narrative. They paint Iran as an isolated desert republic, a lone rogue state surviving on smuggled weapons and religious fervor. They tell the public that decades of crippling sanctions have successfully cut Tehran off from the rest of the civilized world. That is a lethal, catastrophic illusion. The United States is not fighting a solitary nation in the Middle East. We are fighting a fully integrated Eurasian defense industrial complex, and Iran is merely the violent front door. When a suicide drone launches toward an American position, the fiberglass fuselage might be molded in Tehran, but the nervous system of that weapon is entirely foreign. Russia is operating as the untouchable eyes of this conflict. Moscow is feeding exquisite, real-time satellite telemetry directly to Iranian command centers. They are providing the precise coordinates of American fleet vulnerabilities, effectively turning cheap, expendable munitions into highly lethal, precision-guided ship killers. Standing right beside them is the ultimate economic shield. China is serving as both the financial vault and the unbreakable supply chain. Beijing is actively purchasing massive quantities of embargoed Iranian oil, flooding the regime with cash and completely bypassing the United States dollar. More importantly, Chinese factories are quietly pumping out the critical microelectronics, flight controllers, and targeting sensors that keep the Iranian drone assembly lines running 24 hours a day. Washington is trapped in a terrible deception. The politicians stand at their podiums and pretend they can simply bomb Tehran into submission, but they are absolutely terrified to admit the real geopolitical nightmare. The United States is currently engaged in a shadow world war against two heavily armed global superpowers, and those superpowers are using the Middle East to bleed the American empire to death without ever putting their own soldiers on the battlefield. Most Americans believe this war is confined to a desert 6,000 miles away. They watch the distant explosions on their screens and assume the destruction stops at the borders of the Middle East. But the true casualty of this conflict is sitting right on your kitchen table. The evening news might casually mention that fuel prices have gone up by over $1 a gallon. That is a painful sting for the working class, but it is merely a superficial scratch on the surface of a catastrophic economic collapse. The real crisis is not about petroleum, it is about the absolute foundation of human survival. Right now, 30% of global ammonia production is directly exposed to the relentless missile strikes raining down on the Gulf energy infrastructure. Ammonia is the vital chemical ingredient for the fertilizers that sustain corn, wheat, rice, and soybean cultivation across the entire world. American farmers are standing in their fields right now, trying to make their spring planting decisions while staring down the barrel of an unprecedented supply chain disruption. If the fertilizer pipeline from the Middle East fractures, the crops simply will not grow. The heartland soil will remain bare. This is not some abstract geopolitical theory debated in the sterile halls of Washington. This is a brutal agricultural domino effect that will crush everyday citizens. When the global fertilizer supply breaks, the American agricultural sector will be pushed toward total bankruptcy. Within months, the cost of a simple trip to the local grocery store will skyrocket, adding hundreds of dollars to the monthly bills of families who had absolutely no say in entering this conflict. The United States government is using billions of taxpayer dollars to fund a foreign war that is actively destroying the domestic food supply. The American public is being forced to pay an astronomical price just to starve itself. Look at the glittering skylines of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. For decades, these oil superpowers operated under a simple and unbreakable geopolitical contract. They provided the petroleum that fueled the global economy, and the United States military provided the ironclad guarantee of their national security. But today, as Washington prepares to launch amphibious assault forces toward Iranian shores, those historic allies have gone completely silent. They are not offering their airspace. They are not cheering for an American victory. They are terrified. The strategists in Tehran have executed a brilliant diplomatic checkmate. They delivered a quiet but unmistakable ultimatum to their Arab neighbors. If the United States military uses regional bases to seize Karg Island or launch a ground invasion, the retaliatory missile strikes will not just target American uniforms. The Iranian missile network will immediately pivot and burn the Saudi and Emirati oil fields to the absolute ground. The Gulf states suddenly woke up to find themselves trapped as living hostages. They realize that participating in Washington's war means immediate economic suicide. So they are quietly walking away from the American empire. Late last month, the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan gathered in Islamabad to broker a desperate diplomatic channel. The United States and Israel were explicitly excluded from the room. That absence is a massive geopolitical earthquake. The nations that once relied entirely on American protection are now actively working behind Washington's back to save themselves from a war they know America cannot win. The Middle Eastern alliance has not just fractured, it has completely dissolved, leaving the United States isolated in a desert it no longer controls. The official narrative broadcast into your living room describes a conflict moving toward a neat and organized diplomatic resolution. The operational reality tells a terrifyingly different story. The true picture of this war features 400,000 mobilized troops unable to take a single frontline town. It features a heavily censored casualty list and one of the deadliest military strikes of the campaign, hidden entirely from the public eye. The diplomatic track is a phantom, a calculated stalling tactic by an enemy that openly mocks the negotiations while simultaneously adding new geographic fronts to bleed the United States dry. Now, Washington is rushing blindly toward the point of no return. Amphibious assault forces are actively moving into position. The administration is floating the idea of seizing island energy terminals. They are preparing to order American soldiers to march into the most hostile and unforgiving terrain on the planet. And they are about to do it entirely alone. The allied nation whose security interests were the absolute stated justification for this entire war just broadcast to its own citizens that it will not participate in a ground invasion. They are walking away from the hardest and most lethal part of the conflict. They are leaving the American working class to absorb the staggering economic shockwaves, and they are leaving the American military to pay the ultimate price in blood. 10 helicopters flew in the dark because the truth they carried could not survive the light of day. Your soldiers are currently being moved into the crosshairs. Your tax dollars are funding the catastrophe, and the public is always the last to know before the trap completely snaps shut. If you want to survive the economic and geopolitical shock that is coming, you have to wake up right now. Support independent journalism. Share this broadcast with everyone you know who is still trusting the mainstream narrative. The time for blind faith is over. You have been warned.